Everyone, welcome and thank you for joining ΣիվիլΝeթ today. Our guest is Karena Avedissian. She's a fellow at the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. Thank you for being here today, Karena.
Thank you, Rubina.
I know you're on your way back, but you're working on this very interesting research, and I'd like to learn more about it, to talk more about it. Could you just please tell us how it started, what's the research, what you're doing?
Yeah, of course. So I'm working on a research project at the moment. The idea started as a sort of follow-up to a piece of research that was done in 1993-94 by a professor at USC named Don Miller. He and his wife came to Armenia and did a lot of interviews with people in 4 categories. So these are people who are refugees from Azerbaijan, refugees from the Nagorno-Karabakh war, people who survived the Gyumri Spitak earthquake, and normal residents of Armenia that were living through the blockade. And the questions were really interesting to me because they really got into sort of people's daily lives. People were asked what was most important to them during these days. And because it was 1993-94, a lot of the conversation revolved around the difficulties, lack of fuel, lack of food, and sort of this sense of hope that things were going to get better. So we decided to do, we at USC, I'm the principal researcher on this project, to ask people now in contemporary the Republic of Armenia similar questions to kind of get a sense of where we've come.
So in this sense, this is very interesting because there's like this disconnect between 1993 and 94 and now through this research, you're kind of bringing together data that will come to a conclusion. Was the initial were the initial interviews concluded? Was there a conclusion on the first research done?
So they weren't analyzed. So I have access to the transcripts, which Don Miller very graciously has given me access to. He wrote an interesting book called Armenia, Portraits of Survival and Hope, based on his experience doing this research. And he took excerpts of his interviews and drew from them for his book as well. But it's a really interesting process analyzing those old interviews and looking at the interviews from today, because you get this sort of picture of people's personal relationship with state building since independence.
And anything unexpected or interesting you came across during the interviews?
I did. One unexpected thing I came across was the difference in perspectives between generations. So people 30 and under had a completely different perspective on the world around them and then people older than that. And I have a feeling that that's mostly due to exposure to the internet and sort of a multitude of sources of information that they have to kind of filter through and gain some kind of understanding of what's going on. The other interesting thing is comparing with the old interviews where people were talking about the difficulties of living with a blockade and after all these sort of traumatic events of war and earthquake. Now people's material lives have gotten better to some extent, but people's problems now seem to revolve around a new sense of inequality in Armenian society, this sort of socioeconomic inequality that people really, all of my respondents spoke of that as the sort of main problem. So that was kind of, that's what's coming out of that, I feel, at this point.
So basically what was rationalized, the bad situation that was rationalized in 94, 93 because of the conflict, because of the earthquake, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, now...
Exactly. There was this sense in 93, 94, you get this sense from the interviews that people felt like everyone was in the same boat. And yes, it was super difficult, but there was a reason for this. And that was, newly independent state and all of these traumatic events that had happened. And of course, things were going to get difficult, but there was hope that things were going to get better. And now, when you look at the interviews from recently, I did my interviews in November and December, you get this feeling of disappointment and a sense of injustice in terms of governance that doesn't seem to be working from the respondents' perspectives. And that after all of this, it's as if there's this acknowledgement that a small group of people in Armenia have basically gotten most of the money and power, and everyone else is more or less disenfranchised. And I'd like to also note that most of my respondents were of the middle class. I made an effort to talk to people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds as well. But even the distance, social distance between middle class and lower socioeconomic people is also very large and very difficult to get introduced to people in different strata.
And how about, you spoke about people from two different generations and their perspective. And how about people who were relatively the same group who were interviewed in 94, 95, and they were interviewed now? How has their perspective or the way they remember the first years of independence changed? Have you noticed any?
I have. There were some interesting responses I got. For example, in general, I felt that with the older respondents this time around, there was a level of amnesia which is probably too expected. I mean, they're not going to remember events that happened 25 years ago in a great level of detail. But in some cases, this was quite extreme. I did ask one woman who was from Gyumri, and now residing in Yerevan. She was around 50 years old, and when I asked her her opinion of the war, just saying the war, not Nagorno-Karabakh, but meaning that, I mean, in Armenia, that's kind of assumed. She kind of looked confused and said, I wasn't born then. And then I realized that she's talking about World War II. And I said, no, I'm talking about Nagorno-Karabakh. And she was like, which one was that? And it was this kind of weird response that I'm sure it's really rare. I'm sure if you go around asking people in Yerevan, everyone will know what you're talking about. But the only sort of explanation I have for this is that her hardships since losing her home in Gyumri, moving to Yerevan, and basically struggling for 25 years has put those kinds of events in the background in her sort of conscious sort of interaction with life.
And you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh. Seems to be that now there's basically the same situation is repeating, history is repeating itself. When this study was done first, there was the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and now we're on the verge of it or in the middle of it. It's a matter of perspective. Is this an opportunity for you to extend your studies, or what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Just even regarding Republic of Armenia, there is very little research that's being done on contemporary Armenia in terms of its politics, society, economy. Karabakh is so much more neglected in that way. So hopefully there will be the opportunity to follow up this research with similar research done in Nagorno-Karabakh. Obviously, the conflict there sort of takes precedence in terms of what people are interested in. But even despite this conflict, people are living daily lives and dealing with daily issues. And it would be really interesting, I think, if someone, kind of put that up to analysis.
And also the way that now we have information from, questionnaires from 1994 that are coming in really handy today.
Yeah, I almost feel, so the interviews were conducted in November and December of 2015, so this is obviously before the 4-day conflict, and I really wonder how the responses would have changed if I had done these interviews after.
Do you think of doing a follow-up? Do you think that there's a chance that you might?
Not for this particular project. I think I have enough data to do an analysis on what that is, but I think it's always worth doing follow-ups. Just in the course of doing research, all kinds of questions pop up, and you remember things that people said, and you wonder what that meant. And you could go down these different channels to analyze those aspects as well. But you kind of have to choose one main one to do that piece of research. But if you have the time and resources to do the others, which hopefully I will, and I can do follow-ups, and it kind of gives more context to that initial piece of research.
And what's going to be the end result of this research that's like stretched so many decades?
Yeah. Hopefully, well, I need to do an analysis of the interviews that I already have, write them up, present them at conferences, hopefully get feedback from other scholars who are working on similar areas to get a better idea of where this can go, and hopefully write an article and publish it. But I think at the end of the day, it's a unique piece of research just in the fact that it focuses not on elites or the state, which most research on Armenia does that, but it's this micro level research which is informed by people's daily lives. and experiences. And I think just that in itself is interesting and hopefully will encourage other similar pieces of research to be done as well.
I mean, I look forward to seeing the results, but since I have you here, and I want to ask any interesting interviews and interesting instances, because this is something that we come face to face daily, but yet are not, because that's not what you're researching or you're trying to understand, you don't understand what you witness on a daily basis, like conversations or bits of information.
Yeah, it's funny because you have the time to think about these things in a different way. And I did have one really interesting interview. I interviewed a young woman, and then I interviewed her mother. And they were supposed to be these separate interviews. But the young woman asked to stay for the interview of her mother, because as the mother started answering my questions, the daughter seemed super shocked, and she'd never heard her mother talk about these things before. So she asked permission to stay and listen. And I said, of course. And her mother's talking about her childhood and how things were different when she was growing up, how young girls needed to learn musical instruments in families and into proper families. And even despite that, she wanted to do sports. She asked her parents permission to do sports, and her parents said no. And she didn't ask why or protest, because that's not what you did back then. And that when she had her own daughters, she made an effort to take them to every single sports that they could do. And her middle daughter apparently didn't like it and said, Mom, one day she said, Mom, can I not go? And she said, of course, anything you want. And at this time, during all of this, the daughter is just, sitting and listening to her mother. And she said, can I ask a question? And I said, yes, of course. So she asked her mother, what did grandma think of how you raised us? And the mother was, she just said, of course she didn't approve, but.
Yeah. But kind of, I think the daughters will start really approving of their mother's efforts at this point.
I think there was this level of appreciation that the young woman had for her mother in this conscious way of raising her that she didn't have before. I don't think she had that perspective.
Yes. And I was not aware that the Institute of Armenian Studies was doing such research. Is there any more research being done or initiatives that?
So the Institute is trying to broaden its programs, and one of the programs that it's giving priority to at the moment is research. So in the future, the Institute will be supporting more research projects like this, and with the hopeful participation of young scholars from Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh as well, which I think will be a very unique perspective and very necessary perspective, I think, in terms of the scholarships that's being done now. I think their perspective is really important.
Because it seems that there aren't enough studies being done, but are there enough scholars or opportunities for such studies? Because it seems to be a cluster of things that need to be done.
Hopefully, with this piece of research and with more support from not only USC but from other universities, more research on Armenia will be encouraged.
Thank you very much, Karina, for being here today and for this interesting talk. And I hope this research is concluded soon and you move on to another research. We look forward to the results. And thank you to the viewers for joining us.